Welcome to the post-corporate transition district in Aldea Zamá. This isn't just a retreat, it's a realignment. District, a reorientation zone for high-agency individuals. Leverage our liminal architecture and dream validation framework.
Part 6, the Post-Corporate Transition District. The Stakeholder Conversation. May 28, 2026. Part 6, the Stakeholders Conversation, Chapter 29. What landlords actually optimize for. The most reliable way to fail the stakeholder conversation. To approach the owners and administrators and developers of Aldea Zamá's physical infrastructure with a proposal for the Transition District's second phase program and to receive, in return, the specific combination of polite interest and fundamental non-engagement that sophisticated institutional actors deploy when they encounter a proposal that is genuinely interesting as an idea and genuinely unattractive as a business proposition, is to enter the conversation from the position of the governing framework's intellectual architecture. The governing framework is intellectually compelling, operationally specific, mythologically rich, and historically grounded. It is also, from the perspective of the specific human beings responsible for the financial performance of specific real estate assets in a specific tourism and lifestyle corridor on the eastern Yucatán coast, essentially unintelligible as a proposition that connects to the specific problems they are trying to solve and the specific metrics they are accountable to. The intellectual architecture of the post-corporate transition district is not the language in which property stakeholders think about their assets, assess the proposals they receive for the use of those assets, or make the specific decisions that determine which uses are accommodated and which are declined. Understanding the language in which property stakeholders actually think is the prerequisite for the stakeholder conversation's success, and the failure to make this understanding the starting point of the conversation's preparation is the specific error that converts what should be a productive negotiation into the exchange of competing monologues that each party conducts in a language the other cannot receive. The property stakeholders' language is not a simple language, and the simplification of it into the caricature of the purely financially motivated actor who responds only to the direct financial case for the proposed use is itself an error that produces a stakeholder conversation strategy as ineffective as the governing framework's direct deployment. The property stakeholder is a complex human being operating within a specific institutional context with specific financial obligations, specific reputational concerns, specific social relationships with other stakeholders in the development's ecosystem, and specific psychological investments in the original vision of the development that the first phase's effort and capital and creative ambition expressed. The property stakeholders' decision-making is not purely financial. It is the product of the specific interaction between the financial pressures, the reputational concerns, the social relationships, and the psychological investments that the stakeholders' specific situation has produced, and the effective stakeholder conversation is the conversation that engages all of these dimensions rather than the purely financial dimension alone. The financial dimension is, however, the most immediately operative and the one that must be engaged first, because it is the dimension that is most directly determining the stakeholders' current openness to alternative proposals for their assets. The financial dimension of the property stakeholders' situation in Aldea Zamá is the specific financial situation produced by the first phase's commercial performance relative to the investment thesis that governed the first phase's development. The situation of a premium real estate development that has not yet achieved the occupancy levels and the rental rates and the asset valuations that the investment thesis anticipated, and that is therefore generating the specific financial pressure on the stakeholder to find uses for the vacant assets that will improve the financial performance of the portfolio. This specific financial pressure is the specific condition that makes the stakeholder conversation possible at all, that creates the opening in the stakeholders' decision-making calculus for proposals that would not receive serious consideration if the first phase were performing at the anticipated level, because the performing first phase would provide the stakeholder with no motivation to consider alternative uses for assets that are already generating the anticipated returns. The underperformance is the opening. The opening is the window. The window is what the transition district's second phase strategy must move through before the financial pressure resolves in one of the directions that would close it. The specific financial metrics that the property stakeholder is optimizing for are not a single metric but a specific combination of metrics that interact in ways that the stakeholder conversation strategy must understand precisely to be effective. The first metric is current income, the specific rental income that the vacant commercial spaces and the underoccupied residential units are currently generating or failing to generate, measured against the debt service and operating costs that the portfolio's financial obligations require to be covered. The current income metric is the most immediately pressing financial pressure because it is the metric that determines whether the portfolio is generating sufficient cash flow to service its obligations in the present period, rather than the metric that determines whether the portfolio's long-term value is being maintained or enhanced. The second metric is occupancy rate, the specific proportion of the portfolio's total leasable area that is currently generating rental income, measured against the industry benchmarks for comparable premium developments in comparable geographic and market contexts. The occupancy rate metric is the most immediately visible indicator of the first phase's commercial performance and the metric most directly associated with the stakeholders' reputational standing in the real estate development community, the metric that defines the development's public perception as either a successful activation or an incomplete one. The third metric is asset valuation, the specific current market value of the portfolio's assets, measured against the values that the investment thesis anticipated and the values that the stakeholders' financial obligations, to investors, to lenders, to partners, require the portfolio to maintain. The asset valuation metric is the most forward-looking of the three primary metrics and the one most directly influenced by the long-term trajectory of the development's identity and reputation, rather than the short-term financial performance of the current period's rental income and occupancy. The relationship between these three metrics and the Transition District Second Phase program is the relationship that the stakeholder conversation must make legible, must translate the governing framework's intellectual architecture into the specific language of financial metrics that the property stakeholders' decision-making is organized around. The translation requires the identification of the specific mechanisms through which the second phase's activation of the district's vacant commercial spaces with the Transition District's cultural programming is likely to improve each of the three primary financial metrics relative to the baseline of continued vacancy or conventional lower-tier commercial activation. The current income metric is the metric that the second phase strategy improves most immediately but least dramatically. The experimental accommodation model, the temporary activation leases, and the rotating cultural occupation arrangements that Part 3 of the stakeholder conversation strategy describes in detail, generates rental income from spaces that are currently generating no income, improving the current income metric by the specific amount of the below-market rents that the experimental accommodation arrangements provide. The improvement is real but modest in the short term. The experimental accommodation rents are below market by design, calibrated to the second phase program's specific financial constraints during the founding period rather than to the market rates that the first phase commercial logic anticipated. The current income argument is therefore not the primary financial argument for the stakeholder conversation. It is a necessary element of the argument that demonstrates the second phase's immediate financial contribution to the portfolio's cash flow, but it is not the element that will determine the stakeholder's decision, because the modest improvement in current income that the experimental accommodation model provides is not sufficient, by itself, to justify the stakeholder's acceptance of a program that is unconventional in its specific requirements and that introduces an unfamiliar community into the development's ecosystem. The current income argument is the threshold argument, the demonstration that the second phase generates some immediate financial improvement that justifies the stakeholders' engagement with the fuller argument, rather than the decisive argument that produces the stakeholders' commitment on its own terms. The occupancy rate metric is the metric that the second phase strategy improves most visibly and most immediately in the measure that is most consequential for the stakeholders' reputational standing. The experimental accommodation model's activation of vacant commercial spaces with the Transition District's cultural programming converts the specific visible vacancy, the dark storefront, the empty plaza, the unoccupied commercial unit that communicates the development's incomplete activation to every visitor and every observer, into the specific visible activation that communicates the development's ongoing vitality and its continued relevance as a destination for the specific class of people whose presence in the development is the primary evidence of the development's premium positioning. The occupancy rate improvement is not merely the financial improvement of the metric's specific numerical value. It is the atmospheric improvement of the development's visible condition that the improvement in the metric's numerical value represents, the specific conversion of the vacant storefront's negative atmospheric contribution into the cultural programming's positive atmospheric contribution that is the most immediately perceivable evidence of the second phase's value to the stakeholders' reputational standing. The asset valuation metric is the metric that the second phase strategy improves most significantly but least immediately and most contingently. Contingently because the asset valuation improvement depends on the second phase's successful development into the globally recognized transition district that the strategy is aimed at rather than on the immediate implementation of the experimental accommodation model's first phase activations. The asset valuation argument is the long-term argument for the stakeholder conversation, the argument that the second phase's successful development will produce the specific quality of global recognition and cultural distinction that converts the development from a premium lifestyle development with incomplete activation into a globally recognized post-corporate transition district with a specific cultural identity and a specific global reputation that commands a significant premium over comparable developments in comparable geographies. The premium is real and it is large. The specific premium that a globally recognized cultural destination commands over a merely premium lifestyle development is the kind of premium that produces transformative effects on asset valuations, but it is achievable only through the sustained, quality-committed development of the second phase's program rather than through any short-term intervention that the stakeholder conversation's first stage can promise to deliver. The asset valuation argument must be made with the specific combination of honest acknowledgement of its long-term character and genuine evidence of its directional validity that distinguishes the credible long-term argument from the speculative promise that the property stakeholders' prior experience of ambitious development proposals has made them appropriately skeptical of. The honest acknowledgement requires the admission that the asset valuation improvement is not immediate and is not guaranteed, that it depends on the second phase's successful development, which depends on the quality of the community's cultural production and the global reach of its publishing ecosystem and the specific quality of the founding cohort's operational practice, all of which are subject to the specific uncertainties of any ambitious program's execution. The genuine evidence requires the presentation of the specific historical cases, the comparable instances of cultural activation's impact on premium real estate valuations in comparable developments in comparable geographies, that demonstrate the directional validity of the argument even in the absence of a precise prediction of the magnitude of the valuation improvement that the second phase's specific execution will produce in Aldea Zamá's specific conditions. The reputational dimension of the stakeholders' decision-making is the dimension that is most underweight in the standard approaches to the stakeholder conversation, and that the transition district's second phase strategy is most specifically positioned to address. The property stakeholders' reputational concerns are not merely the concerns of a commercially motivated actor who is anxious about the market's perception of the development's performance. They are the concerns of a person who has invested significant creative ambition and significant personal identification in the development's original vision, and who is therefore subject to the specific form of reputational vulnerability that comes from the gap between the original vision's ambition and the development's current incomplete activation. The stakeholder who developed Aldea Zamá with a genuine vision of a premium built environment at the intersection of ecological intelligence and contemporary design excellence is not indifferent to the current condition of partial vacancy. They are the specific kind of person for whom the current condition is a source of genuine disappointment that goes beyond the purely financial disappointment of underperformance. The transition district's second phase strategy offers the stakeholder not merely the financial improvement of the portfolio's metrics, but the specific reputational redemption of a narrative reframing that converts the incomplete activation from the evidence of the vision's failure into the evidence of the vision's next evolutionary stage, that offers the stakeholder the specific opportunity to be the person who recognized the opportunity to define the first globally recognized post-corporate transition district before anyone else did, and who acted on that recognition with the specific combination of intellectual sophistication and commercial pragmatism that the experimental accommodation model represents. The social dimension of the stakeholders' decision-making is the dimension most specific to the specific social relationships and social dynamics of the Tulum Corridor's development community, and the dimension that the stakeholder conversation strategy must be most sensitive to in its specific local application. The property stakeholders of Aldea Zamá do not make decisions in isolation from the specific social community of developers, investors, administrators, local authorities, and cultural and commercial operators who constitute the Tulum Corridor's development ecosystem, and the second phase strategy's reception among these stakeholders will be significantly influenced by the specific social dynamics of that ecosystem, by which stakeholders are most influential in the ecosystem's social hierarchy, Which stakeholders are most likely to be early adopters of the experimental accommodation model whose adoption would influence others, and which stakeholders are most resistant to the specific unconventionality of the second phase program and whose resistance would, if activated prematurely, produce the specific social momentum against the program that the stakeholder conversation strategy must be designed to avoid generating. The social dimension requires the stakeholder conversation strategy to be sequenced with the specific attention to the ecosystem's social dynamics that the standard approaches to development proposals typically neglect in favor of the direct bilateral negotiation with each individual stakeholder. The sequencing principle is the principle of the influential early adopter, the identification of the specific stakeholder or stakeholders in the development ecosystem who are most likely to be genuinely receptive to the second phase program's proposal, most influential in the ecosystem's social hierarchy, and most capable of producing the specific social proof of the program's legitimacy that the subsequent stakeholder conversations require to proceed effectively. The influential early adopter is not necessarily the largest stakeholder or the most financially powerful one. It is the stakeholder whose specific combination of social influence, genuine intellectual receptivity to the program's governing concept, and specific current financial situation makes them the most likely to provide the genuine early endorsement that converts the second phase program from an interesting but unconventional proposal into an endorsed and therefore legitimized option. Within the development ecosystem's social framework, the psychological dimension of the stakeholders' decision-making is the dimension most specific to the individual stakeholder's personal relationship to the first phase's original vision and most sensitive to the specific forms of language and framing that the stakeholder conversation employs in its engagement with that relationship. The Transition District's second phase strategy is proposing a fundamental reframing of the first phase's commercial logic, a reframing that, if presented as a critique of the first phase, will activate the specific psychological defensiveness of the person whose significant personal investment in the first phase's original vision makes any critique of that vision feel like a critique of them personally. The reframing must be presented not as a critique but as an evolution, not as the evidence that the first phase's vision was wrong, but as the evidence that the first phase's vision was sophisticated enough to produce the specific spatial and atmospheric conditions that the second phase requires as its foundation, and that the second phase is therefore the specific realization of the first phase's deepest potential rather than the correction of its specific failures. The language of the second evolutionary phase, the specific framing that this handbook identified in its earlier treatment of the stakeholder conversation strategy, and that Chapter 30 will develop in full operational detail, is the primary instrument of this psychological reframing. The phrase is chosen with the specific precision that the reframing's psychological requirements demand. Evolutionary rather than corrective, second rather than alternative, phase rather than replacement. Each element of the phrase is doing specific work in the specific psychological context of the property stakeholder's relationship to the first phase's original vision. Evolutionary encodes the continuity between the first and second phases, the specific message that the second phase is a development of the first phase's inherent potential rather than a departure from its governing vision. Second encodes the sequence, the specific message that the first phase is complete rather than failed, that it produced the specific conditions that the second phase requires rather than the specific outcomes that the investment thesis anticipated. Phase encodes the temporality, the specific message that the second phase is part of a longer development arc rather than a terminal alternative to the first phase's model, that the development story is continuing rather than ending. The stakeholder conversation is therefore not primarily a financial negotiation or a real estate transaction or a business development pitch. It is a specific act of narrative reframing, conducted with the specific sensitivity to the stakeholders' financial pressures and reputational concerns and social relationships and psychological investments that genuine engagement with the stakeholders' actual decision-making context requires, aimed at producing the specific shift in the stakeholders' understanding of the development's current situation and future possibilities that converts the experimental accommodation model from an unconventional proposal into the obvious next step of the development's natural evolution. The reframing is the work. The negotiation of the specific terms of the experimental accommodation arrangements is the form the work takes. And the specific quality of the reframing, the specific combination of honest acknowledgement of the current situation's challenges and genuine vision for the next phase's possibilities, is the primary determinant of whether the stakeholder conversation produces the experimental accommodation model's first agreements or the polite interest and fundamental non-engagement that the governing framework's direct deployment would have produced. The property stakeholder is not an obstacle to be overcome. They are a person in a specific situation with specific concerns and specific ambitions and specific investments in the development success that are, in the most fundamental sense, aligned with the transition district's second phase strategy rather than opposed to it. Aligned because both the stakeholders' interests and the second phase strategy's interests are best served by the specific outcome of a successful, globally recognized, culturally vibrant, economically sustainable activation of Aldea Zamá's specific spatial and atmospheric potential. The stakeholder conversation is the process of making this alignment visible to both parties, of revealing the specific convergence between the stakeholders' financial and reputational interests and the second phase strategy's cultural and civilizational ambitions that the superficial difference in their respective languages and frameworks conceals. The alignment is real. The conversation is the instrument of its revelation. The experimental accommodation model is the specific form in which the revealed alignment produces its first concrete expression. And the first concrete expression is the beginning of the stakeholder relationship that the transition district's second phase requires for its full development. Part 6, the Stakeholder Conversation Chapter 30, the language of the second evolutionary phase. Language is not the vehicle for the stakeholder conversation's content. Language is the content. The specific words chosen, the specific metaphors employed, the specific sequence in which the argument is constructed, the specific emotional register in which the conversation is conducted, and the specific vocabulary through which the development's current situation and future possibilities are described. These are not merely the stylistic wrapping of the underlying argument but the argument itself, because the stakeholder's response to the argument is not primarily a response to the argument's logical content but to the specific emotional and psychological experience that the argument's specific language produces in the person receiving it. The most logically impeccable argument for the Transition District's second phase program will produce the specific experience of being told that the first phase failed and that an unconventional replacement program is being proposed in its stead, if the argument is constructed in the language that makes that experience inevitable, regardless of whether the logical content of the argument intends or implies any such message. The specific language that avoids producing that experience while making the same logical case is not a softening of the argument. It is the precise instrument that allows the argument's genuine content to be received rather than blocked by the psychological defensiveness that the wrong language activates before the argument's genuine content can reach the stakeholder's decision-making faculty. This chapter is a vocabulary, not a complete vocabulary. The specific stakeholder conversation's specific language must be adapted to the specific individual stakeholder's specific situation, specific vocabulary, and specific psychological relationship to the development's history, in ways that require the practitioner conducting the conversation to have the specific situational intelligence about the specific stakeholder that no general vocabulary can fully provide. But a governing vocabulary, the specific set of terms, framings, metaphors, distinctions, and rhetorical principles that define the language within which the effective stakeholder conversation operates and outside which the conversation consistently fails to produce the specific outcomes that the second phase strategy requires. The governing vocabulary is organized around three primary commitments: the commitment to never implying failure, the commitment to always implying trajectory, and the commitment to consistently positioning the second phase as the development's natural evolution rather than its corrective intervention. These three commitments determine every specific language choice the governing vocabulary makes, and their violation, the single use of the wrong phrase in the wrong context with the wrong stakeholder, can undo the specific quality of the conversation's carefully constructed psychological atmosphere in ways that the conversation's subsequent recovery may or may not be able to address. The commitment to never implying failure is the most fundamental of the three, and the one whose violation is most immediately consequential. It does not require the dishonest denial of the development's current incomplete activation. The stakeholder knows the development's current condition, has been living with the specific financial and psychological realities of the incomplete activation every day, and will receive any attempt to pretend otherwise as both dishonest and condescending. It requires the specific reframing of the incomplete activation that makes it legible as something other than failure, and the reframing is not dishonest because the incomplete activation genuinely is something other than failure, for the specific reasons that Part 2 of this handbook has established in detail. It is the specific liminal condition of a built environment between the completion of its first phase and the determination of its second, a condition that has the specific strategic properties that the preceding chapters have described, and that is therefore not the evidence of the first phase's failure, but the specific precondition of the second phase's possibility. The governing vocabulary encodes this understanding in every specific language choice that addresses the current condition, encoding it not through explicit statement, which would be too obvious to be persuasive, but through the specific selection of terms that make the liminal condition's strategic properties the natural reading of the language rather than the explicit argument the language is making. The vocabulary of the current condition is the most immediately consequential element of the governing vocabulary because it is the vocabulary that the stakeholder conversation must establish in its opening before the argument for the second phase can proceed. The vocabulary choices that make the current condition available for the reframing the second phase requires are the following. The condition itself is described as a period of strategic recalibration rather than vacancy or underperformance or incomplete activation. Strategic encodes the intentionality that converts the condition from something that has happened to the development into something the development is doing. Recalibration encodes the specific quality of a calibration process that is adjusting toward a better alignment rather than failing to maintain the previous alignment, and period encodes the temporality that makes the condition a phase rather than a permanent state. The spaces that are currently unoccupied are described as available for activation rather than vacant. Available encodes the potential that vacancy suppresses. Activation encodes the specific quality of the use the second phase proposes rather than the generic use that conventional leasing implies. And the combination converts the specific material fact of the empty commercial unit from a liability into a resource. The development's commercial performance relative to the investment thesis is described as tracking a longer development arc rather than underperforming. Tracking encodes the continued relationship to the original thesis that preserves the first phase's vision rather than departing from it. Longer encodes the reframing of the timeline rather than the abandonment of the destination. And development arc encodes the specific understanding of premium development's trajectory that the governing vocabulary is proposing the stakeholder adopt as the primary framework for understanding the development's current situation. The vocabulary of the second phase itself is the element of the governing vocabulary that most directly determines the stakeholder's initial psychological reception of the proposal, and that must therefore be developed with the greatest care for the specific psychological dynamics of the stakeholder's relationship to the development's history and future. The phrase second evolutionary phase is the governing vocabulary's primary designation for the second phase, and its three components have been analyzed in the preceding chapter's brief treatment. The full vocabulary of the second phase elaborates the phrase's governing concept through a set of specific supporting terms and framings that together constitute the complete language in which the second phase is described to the property stakeholder. The cultural activation ecosystem is the term that most specifically describes the second phase's programmatic content in language accessible to the property stakeholder. Cultural encodes the specific quality of the activities the program involves. Activation encodes the specific effect on the development's condition that the program is designed to produce, and ecosystem encodes the organic, self-sustaining quality of the program's development rather than the imposed, externally managed quality of a conventional cultural programming initiative. The post-professional transition community is the term that most specifically describes the second phase's human population in language that is both accurate and accessible to the stakeholder, without activating the specific vocabulary of the alternative lifestyle movements. Post-professional rather than post-corporate or post-institutional, because post-professional accurately describes the specific population and engages the stakeholder's specific understanding of the premium professional market without the ideological associations that post-corporate and post-institutional carry in the cultural context that the stakeholder is most likely to be familiar with. Transition encodes the specific quality of the population's engagement with the district as a purposeful and temporary phase rather than a permanent alternative lifestyle, which is a critical distinction for the stakeholder who is concerned about the district's long-term premium positioning. And community encodes the specific quality of genuine social cohesion and shared purpose that the governing framework has established as the second phase's primary output, rather than the aggregate of individual users that a co-working space or a hotel would describe. The vocabulary of the second phase's value proposition to the stakeholder is the element that most directly translates the governing framework's cultural and civilizational ambitions into the financial and reputational language that the property stakeholder's decision-making is organized around. The governing vocabulary's primary value proposition terms are organized around four primary dimensions of value that the second phase generates for the stakeholder's portfolio. The atmospheric value dimension is addressed through the vocabulary of cultural density, the specific combination of activity, visible inhabitation, genuine intellectual and creative production, and the specific quality of human presence that the second phase's program generates in the district spaces, producing the specific atmospheric improvement that converts the development from a beautiful but underoccupied premium environment into a visibly and genuinely activated cultural destination. The specific terms that carry this concept are generative cultural density, activated intellectual community, and visible production ecosystem, each of which describes the specific quality of the second phase's atmospheric contribution in terms that are legible to the stakeholder as improvements to the development's ambient quality rather than as ideological commitments of the governing framework. The reputational value dimension is addressed through the vocabulary of category distinction, the specific quality of the second phase's globally recognized positioning as the first post-corporate transition district that converts the development from a premium lifestyle development in a competitive market into a globally recognized category-defining instance of a new development model. The specific terms that carry this concept are first-mover category leadership, global destination positioning, and cultural category definition, each of which describes the specific quality of the second phase's reputational contribution to the stakeholder's portfolio in terms that are legible to the stakeholder as improvements to the development's market positioning, rather than as aspirational claims of the governing framework's civilizational ambitions. The financial value dimension is addressed through the vocabulary of premium stabilization, the specific quality of the second phase's contribution to the development's long-term asset valuation through the specific mechanism of cultural distinction converting into premium pricing power in the commercial and residential leasing markets that the development's full activation will eventually address. The specific terms that carry this concept are cultural premium capture, destination premium positioning, and distinction-based value stabilization, each of which describes the specific quality of the second phase's financial contribution to the stakeholder's portfolio in terms that are legible to the property investment community's specific vocabulary for the relationship between cultural distinction and asset valuation. The timing value dimension is the fourth and in many respects most immediately persuasive dimension of the value proposition vocabulary, because it addresses the specific question that every sophisticated stakeholder will ask upon receiving any proposal for the activation of their underperforming assets. Why now, and why this rather than the alternatives that the conventional market is making available? The governing vocabulary's answer to this question is organized around the concept of the strategic window, the specific terminology that this handbook has developed in Part 2's treatment of the window and why it closes, translated into the specific language that the property stakeholders' decision-making framework makes most immediately legible. The strategic window vocabulary includes the terms first-mover advantage period, cultural category founding opportunity, and generative liminal condition, each of which describes the specific quality of the current moment's strategic opportunity for the stakeholder in terms that are accurate, that are specific, and that carry the specific urgency of the time-limited opportunity without the artificial pressure of the sales technique that the stakeholder's sophisticated assessment of development proposals would immediately identify and dismiss as a manipulation. The urgency is real and the vocabulary must convey the genuine urgency without manufacturing a false one. And the real urgency is conveyable in the vocabulary of the strategic window-specific mechanics rather than through the vocabulary of manufactured scarcity that the sales technique employs. The vocabulary of what never to say is as important as the vocabulary of what to say, and its importance derives from the specific asymmetry between the opening and the closing of the stakeholder conversation. It takes a carefully constructed sequence of effective language choices to open the stakeholder's genuine receptivity to the second phase proposal, and it takes a single effective language choice in the wrong direction to close the receptivity that the preceding sequence has built. The never say vocabulary is therefore not a list of the terms that are merely less effective than their alternatives. It is a list of the terms whose use produces a specific and typically irreversible closing of the stakeholder's receptivity that the conversation's subsequent recovery cannot reliably undo. The most consequential entries in the never say vocabulary are the following. Never say vacant. Vacant is the property investment community's vocabulary for a specific and unambiguous failure, the failure of an asset to attract the use it was designed for, generating the specific negative financial and reputational consequences that vacancy produces. The stakeholder who has been managing the specific financial and psychological experience of vacancy for a significant period of time does not need to be told that their development has vacant spaces. They know this with a specificity that no conversational introduction of the term could add to. The introduction of the term in the stakeholder conversation serves only to remind the stakeholder of the specific experience of the failure it describes at the precise moment when the conversation is attempting to establish the reframing that converts the current condition from failure to strategic opportunity. The reframing is blocked by the very word that the stakeholder's experience has already associated with the specific quality of the failure being reframed. Replace vacant with available for activation, awaiting cultural programming, holding strategic capacity, or the specific spatial resource that the second phase program requires, each of which encodes the same physical fact in language that is oriented toward the second phase's potential rather than the first phase's incomplete achievement. Never say decline. Decline is the real estate market's vocabulary for the specific trajectory of a development whose asset values and occupancy rates are moving in the direction of the confirmed failure that recovery strategies are designed to prevent. The stakeholder who is concerned about the development's trajectory does not need the conversation's introduction of the word decline to activate the specific anxiety that the word's association with confirmed failure produces. The anxiety is already present in the stakeholder's experience of the development's current situation, and the word's introduction in the conversation amplifies the anxiety at the precise moment when the conversation is attempting to establish the confidence in the second phase's specific solution that the second phase proposal requires the stakeholder to develop. Replace decline with recalibration phase, transition period, strategic pause, or repositioning interval, each of which encodes the same directional observation in language that is oriented toward the correction that the period requires rather than the confirmed failure that the period might be producing. Never say save, rescue, or revive. These are the vocabulary of the emergency response to a confirmed failure, the vocabulary that positions the second phase program as the intervention that prevents the catastrophe that the first phase's continuation would otherwise produce. The stakeholder whose development is characterized as requiring saving or rescuing or reviving has been told, in the specific language of the emergency response vocabulary, that their development is in a condition of confirmed failure from which the second phase program is offering to rescue it. The specific psychological experience of being offered rescue from one's own confirmed failure is the specific experience that activates the deepest and most durable form of the stakeholder's defensive resistance. The resistance not merely to the specific proposal being offered but to the specific characterization of the development situation that the offer of rescue implies. Replace save, rescue, and revive with evolve, activate, position, develop, and realize, each of which encodes the specific orientation toward the development's potential rather than the development's deficiency that the reframing requires. Never say alternative. Alternative is the vocabulary that positions the second phase program as the replacement for the first phase model, the different approach that is being proposed because the original approach has failed or proven inadequate. The stakeholder who has invested significant capital and creative ambition in the original approach will receive the characterization of the second phase program as an alternative as the specific implicit claim that the original approach was wrong, which is the characterization most likely to activate the specific psychological investment in the original approach's defense that converts the stakeholder from a potential partner in the second phase's development into an advocate for the first phase's continued pursuit. Replace alternative with next phase, evolution, development, and extension, each of which encodes the specific relationship of continuity with the first phase that the reframing requires rather than the relationship of replacement that alternative implies. Never say co-working. Co-working is the vocabulary of the specific development category that the Tulum corridor has most thoroughly saturated and most thoroughly exhausted as a concept that attracts the specific class of tenants that premium developments require as the evidence of their cultural standing. The stakeholder who has watched the specific trajectory of the Tulum corridor's co-working space market, the initial excitement of the Nomad Waves activation, the gradual saturation of the category, the specific quality of the occupant mix that the co-working category eventually attracted rather than the premium professional cohort that the category initially promised, will receive the characterization of the second phase program as a co-working initiative with the specific combination of recognition and skepticism that the exhausted category deserves. Replace co-working with sovereign practice infrastructure, post-professional production environment, and cultural operational ecosystem, each of which encodes the specific quality of the second phase program that distinguishes it from the conventional co-working category while conveying the specific functional similarity in terms legible to the stakeholder. The vocabulary of the specific physical space's second phase use is the element of the governing vocabulary most immediately relevant to the experimental accommodation model's negotiation and most specifically consequential for the specific terms of the accommodation arrangements that the negotiation is designed to produce. The governing vocabulary's primary terms for the physical space's second phase uses are organized around the specific distinction between the permanent leasing arrangement that the first phase commercial logic was designed to produce and the experimental activation arrangement that the second phase program requires during the founding period. The pilot activation node is the term that most specifically describes the second phase program's requirement for specific commercial spaces. Pilot encodes the experimental character of the arrangement and the limited duration commitment that the founding period requires. Activation encodes the specific quality of the use that the space will be put to in terms that describe the atmospheric improvement the use produces for the entire development rather than the economic return that the tenant generates for the specific space's financial performance, and node encodes the specific quality of the space's role in the second phase program's broader network rather than its isolated commercial function as a standalone retail or hospitality unit. The cultural residency space is the term that most specifically describes the second phase program's requirement for residential spaces whose occupants are the founding cohort's practitioners. Cultural encodes the specific quality of the occupants' activities and their contribution to the development's atmospheric identity. Residency encodes the specific temporal commitment that distinguishes the founding cohort's engagement from the short-term visit of the tourist or the nomad, and space encodes the specific physical fact of the residential unit without the conventional rental vocabulary that would make the residency indistinguishable from the standard short-term lease. The vocabulary of the stakeholder's specific return on the experimental accommodation arrangement is the element that must complete the financial argument without reducing the second phase program to the purely financial case that the preceding analysis has established is insufficient to produce the stakeholder's genuine commitment. The governing vocabulary's primary terms for the return on the experimental accommodation are organized around the distinction between the immediate financial return of the conventional lease and the compound return of the atmospheric, reputational, and long-term financial improvements that the second phase program generates. The atmospheric dividend is the term that most specifically describes the most immediately perceivable return that the experimental accommodation produces for the stakeholder. The specific improvement in the development's ambient quality that the second phase program's cultural activation generates in the spaces immediately surrounding the activated nodes, producing the specific visible evidence of the development's vitality that the development's vacancy has been undermining in the stakeholders' social environment. The cultural distinction premium is the term that most specifically describes the medium-term return that the second phase's global recognition development generates for the stakeholders' portfolio. The specific pricing power that the distinction premium produces in the commercial and residential leasing markets as the development's global recognition converts it from a premium lifestyle development into a category-defining cultural destination. The civilizational first-mover legacy is the term that most specifically describes the long-term return that the second phase program's successful development produces for the stakeholder. The specific quality of historical standing that accrues to the stakeholder who provided the physical foundation for the first globally recognized post-corporate transition district, giving the stakeholders' participation in the second phase's development a specific significance that no amount of conventional premium real estate development could produce. The specific sequence in which the governing vocabulary's elements are deployed in the stakeholder conversation is as consequential as the specific elements themselves, because the sequence determines whether the stakeholder receives each element with the specific psychological openness that the preceding element has prepared or with the specific psychological defensiveness that the preceding element has inadvertently activated. The governing sequence is organized around three primary phases: the establishment of the shared perception of the current situation, the introduction of the reframing that converts the current situation's specific challenges into the second phase's specific opportunities, and the presentation of the experimental accommodation model as the specific low-risk, immediately available first step through which the stakeholder can engage with the second phase's opportunities without committing to the full development of the program before its specific value has been demonstrated. The establishment of the shared perception requires the governing vocabulary's current condition terms, the strategic recalibration, the longer development arc, the available activation capacity, deployed in the specific context of a genuine acknowledgement of the development's specific current situation that demonstrates the conversation's participant has the specific operational intelligence about the development that the genuine engagement with the stakeholder situation requires. The acknowledgement must be precise enough to demonstrate the genuine intelligence and general enough to avoid the specific characterizations of the current condition that the never-say vocabulary has identified as activating the stakeholder's defensiveness. The introduction of the reframing requires the governing vocabulary's second evolutionary phase terms, the cultural activation ecosystem, the post-professional transition community, the strategic windows-specific mechanics, deployed in the specific sequence that builds the reframing from the stakeholder's own established understanding of the development situation rather than introducing it as a foreign framework that must be adopted before the second phase proposal can be assessed. The reframing's introduction must feel like the natural next step of the stakeholder's own reasoning about the development's current situation, rather than the external imposition of the governing framework's conceptual architecture on the stakeholder's existing understanding. And achieving this quality of natural extension requires the specific conversational technique of building each element of the reframing from the specific observations and acknowledgments that the preceding phase of the conversation has established as the shared perception of the current situation. The presentation of the experimental accommodation model requires the governing vocabulary's specific physical space terms and the specific return vocabulary, the pilot activation nodes, the cultural residency spaces, the atmospheric dividend, the cultural distinction premium, the civilizational first mover legacy, deployed in the specific sequence that moves from the most immediately tangible and most immediately risk-assessed element of the experimental accommodation arrangement to the most ambitious and most long-term element, allowing the stakeholder to engage with the immediate and tangible element before the ambitious and long-term element is introduced, and using the stakeholder's engagement with the immediate element as the foundation for the introduction of the ambitious element's specific quality of civilizational ambition that is the conversation's ultimate destination. The governing vocabulary is not a script. The stakeholder conversation conducted from a script produces the specific quality of the performed pitch that the property stakeholder's extensive experience of development proposals has made them expert at recognizing and expert at deflecting with the polite interest and fundamental non-engagement that the performed pitch consistently receives. The governing vocabulary is a set of principles, the specific principles that define the language within which the effective stakeholder conversation operates, that the practitioner conducting the conversation must have so thoroughly internalized that the specific language choices required in each specific moment of the specific conversation with the specific stakeholder are available as genuine expressions of the practitioner's own understanding of the second phase strategy's governing framework rather than as the performed recitation of the terms the script has specified. The governing vocabulary must become the practitioner's own vocabulary, the specific language in which the practitioner genuinely thinks about the development's current situation and future possibilities, before it can be deployed in the stakeholder conversation with the specific quality of authentic engagement that distinguishes the genuine shared perception from the performed pitch, and that determines whether the stakeholder conversation produces the experimental accommodation model's first agreements or the polite interest and fundamental non-engagement that every other approach has consistently produced. The language is the argument. The argument is the reframing. The reframing is the strategy. The strategy is in the words. Choose them precisely. Use them honestly. Mean them genuinely. And the stakeholder conversation will produce, in the specific language of the second evolutionary phase, the specific outcomes that the second phase strategy requires. Part 6. The Stakeholders Conversation Chapter 31. Seed before you pitch. The sequencing error is the most common and most consequential error in the execution of any strategy whose success depends on demonstrating an achieved reality rather than arguing for a theoretical possibility, and it is the error that the transition district's stakeholder conversation strategy is most specifically and most urgently designed to prevent. The sequencing error is the error of the pitch before the proof, the approach to the stakeholder with the governing framework's intellectual architecture and the second evolutionary phase's governing vocabulary before the cultural seeding that the governing vocabulary describes has produced the specific visible, documentable, socially present evidence of the second phase's operational reality that converts the pitch from the proposal of a theoretical possibility into the invitation to formally host and support a demonstrated reality. The error is seductive because the governing framework is genuinely compelling and the governing vocabulary is genuinely persuasive and the intellectual case for the second phase is genuinely strong, and the person who has developed the governing framework and internalized the governing vocabulary will consistently feel, in the specific excitement of the strategic clarity that the framework and vocabulary provide, that the intellectual case is sufficient to produce the stakeholder's commitment. Without the prior evidence that the seeding phase generates, the feeling is wrong. The intellectual case is necessary but not sufficient. The evidence is the specific thing that converts the necessary into the sufficient. And the evidence can only be produced through the seeding phase that the sequencing error skips. The seeding phase is the specific period of informal, low-capital, high-visibility cultural activity that initiates the second phase's program before the stakeholder conversation has produced the experimental accommodation model's formal agreements. The period in which the founding cohort's committed members begin producing the specific cultural outputs and the specific community gatherings and the specific atmospheric activations that the second phase's governing framework describes. In whatever spaces and through whatever informal arrangements are currently available, generating the visible, documentable evidence of the second phase's operational reality that the stakeholder conversation requires as its primary instrument. The seeding phase does not require stakeholder permission to begin. It does not require formal institutional structures. It does not require the experimental accommodation model's formal agreements. It requires the initiative of the founding cohort's most committed members, acting within whatever spaces are currently available, the working spaces and the residential spaces and the common areas and the restaurants and the natural environments that the founding cohort's current presence in the district provides access to begin producing the specific cultural outputs that the seeding phase is designed to generate. The seeding phase's specific activities are the informal antecedents of the weekly metabolism's formal programmatic elements. The activities that establish the community's cultural presence and produce the community's cultural outputs before the formal program's institutional structures and experimental accommodation arrangements have been secured. The Monday briefing's informal antecedent is the weekly gathering of the founding cohort's members around the accelerating AI landscape's most consequential developments, conducted in a restaurant or a residential space or a shared outdoor area, rather than the dedicated programmatic space that the formal program requires, but producing the specific quality of collective cognitive engagement that the Monday briefing's formal version institutionalizes. The Tuesday publishing session's informal antecedent is the collective production of actual publications by the founding cohort's sovereign publishers, conducted in the co-working spaces and the cafes and the residential spaces that are currently available rather than the dedicated production environment that the formal program requires, but producing the actual publications that the social proof generation function requires as its primary evidence. The Wednesday session's informal antecedent is the small gathering of the founding cohort's creative practitioners around the Super-Earth universe's developing narrative and world-building projects, conducted in whatever space is willing to host a late-evening gathering of people with unusual creative and intellectual ambitions, but producing the actual cultural output that the myth-making function requires as its foundational production. The Thursday dinner's informal antecedent is the regular shared meal in whatever restaurant is willing to host a table of 8 to 10 people for an extended conversation about the specific operational realities of the post-institutional transition. The Friday stress test's informal antecedent is the honest peer assessment of each founding cohort member's developing sovereign practice, conducted in whatever conversational context the founding cohort schedule and the available spaces permit. And the Saturday Atmosphere Night's informal antecedent is the gathering of the founding cohort around whatever visual and cultural production the informal seeding phase has made possible. The projection equipment borrowed from a community member's production toolkit, the NFPs displayed on the tables of whatever common space is willing to host the exhibition, the live publishing dispatches sent from the founding cohort's existing publishing platforms. The informal antecedents are not inferior versions of the formal programmatic elements that the experimental accommodation model will eventually make possible. They are the primary version, the version that is most authentically expressive of the community's genuine culture precisely because it is produced without the institutional support and the dedicated spaces and the formal programmatic structure that the institutional version requires, and that therefore demonstrates the specific quality of the community's genuine commitment that no amount of institutionally supported programming can demonstrate as convincingly as the informal production that is happening because the founding cohort's members cannot not do it. Because the governing framework's intellectual architecture and the governing vocabulary's cultural identity have become sufficiently constitutive of the founding cohort's own identity that the specific activities of the weekly metabolism are being practiced in the founding period's informal conditions for the same reason that genuine practice is always ultimately practiced, because the practitioners cannot imagine not practicing. This is the specific quality of the seeding phase's informal cultural production that makes it the most persuasive possible evidence for the stakeholder conversation. Not the polish of the formal program's institutionally supported production, which any adequately funded initiative can achieve, but the specific organic quality of the informal production that the founding cohort's genuine commitment generates in the absence of institutional support, which only a genuinely committed community can produce. The documentation of the seeding phase's informal cultural production is the activity that converts the informal production from the community's own private cultural experience into the public evidence that the stakeholder conversation requires. The documentation discipline is therefore the seeding phase's most strategically consequential activity, the specific set of practices that determines whether the seeding phase's cultural production becomes the stakeholder conversation's primary instrument or remains the founding cohort's private cultural practice with no external leverage. The documentation discipline consists of 5 specific practices, each of which produces a specific form of the evidence that the stakeholder conversation requires. The photographic documentation is the first and most immediately accessible practice, producing the specific visual evidence of the community's cultural activation that is the most immediately legible form of social proof for the stakeholder audience. The photographic documentation of the seeding phase's informal cultural production must be conducted with the specific combination of aesthetic intelligence and honest representation that the governing framework's commitment to operational honesty in every dimension of the community's cultural production requires. The photographs that honestly represent the seeding phase's informal quality, that show the borrowed projection equipment and the restaurant tables and the improvised display spaces alongside the genuine community engagement and the genuine cultural output that the informal conditions are producing, are more persuasive to the sophisticated stakeholder than the photographs that conceal the informal conditions in the service of the polished presentation, because the sophisticated stakeholder can distinguish between the evidence of genuine cultural activity and the evidence of a well-photographed performance of cultural activity. And the distinction is precisely the distinction that determines whether the stakeholder's response to the social proof is the genuine interest in hosting and supporting the demonstrated reality or the polite interest in the impressively presented proposal. The publication documentation is the second practice, producing the specific textual evidence of the community's intellectual and creative output that is the most specific and most durable form of the social proof for the stakeholder audience with the specific intellectual sophistication to engage with the published content rather than only the visual evidence of the community's activity. The publication documentation consists of the actual publications that the seeding phase's informal Tuesday publishing sessions produce, the actual Substack essays and the actual newsletter issues and the actual NFP productions and the actual social media publications that the founding cohort sovereign publishers are generating through the seeding phase's informal programmatic activities, and that constitute the most direct possible evidence that the community's governing claim, that the sovereign publishing practice is a genuine form of cultural production rather than an aspiration toward cultural production, is being realized in the specific documented form of actual publications reaching actual global audiences. The metrics documentation is the third practice, producing the specific quantitative evidence of the community's cultural production's actual reach and actual audience engagement that the stakeholders' financial assessment of the second phase program's market demand requires. The metrics documentation consists of the specific audience data that the founding cohort sovereign publishing practices are generating, the subscriber counts and the open rates and the engagement metrics and the social media reach figures that the community's publications are producing across their combined distribution channels. The metrics documentation is the specific form of the social proof that translates the community's cultural production into the financial language of demonstrated market demand, the evidence that the community is producing cultural output that a specific, measurable, growing global audience is actively choosing to receive and engage with, which is the specific market validation that the stakeholders' financial assessment of the second phase program's commercial potential requires. The testimonial documentation is the fourth practice, producing the specific qualitative evidence of the community's impact on the specific individuals who have encountered it that is the most emotionally resonant form of the social proof for the stakeholders' assessment of the second phase program's human value. The testimonial documentation consists of the specific honest accounts, collected with the community's characteristic commitment to operational honesty rather than curated for maximum impressiveness, of the specific ways in which the seeding phase's informal community has contributed to the specific transitions of the specific individuals who have participated in it. The testimonials are not success stories in the inspirational sense. They are the specific, honest, operationally detailed accounts of the specific things that the community's informal program has provided that the available alternatives have not, described with the specific granularity and the specific emotional honesty that the governing framework's commitment to operational honesty in every dimension of the community's cultural production requires. The honest testimonial is more persuasive than the curated success story for the same reason that the honest photographic documentation is more persuasive than the polished performance, because the sophisticated stakeholder can distinguish between the evidence of genuine human value and the evidence of a well-curated presentation of claimed human value, and the distinction is precisely what determines whether the stakeholder's response to the testimonial evidence is the genuine interest in hosting the demonstrated reality or the polite interest in the impressively managed proposal. The atmospheric documentation is the fifth practice and the one most specifically relevant to the stakeholder's specific concern about the development's current condition. The atmospheric documentation is the specific visual, acoustic, and narrative evidence of the specific atmospheric improvement that the seeding phase's informal cultural activation produces in the specific spaces of the district where the informal activities are occurring. The specific evidence that the community's cultural presence in those spaces converts the specific atmospheric quality of those spaces from the eerie quality of the between time into the specific quality of genuine cultural activation that the development's long-term positioning as a premium destination requires. The atmospheric documentation is the most immediately persuasive form of the social proof for the property stakeholder whose primary current concern is the atmospheric condition of the development's vacant spaces, because it provides the specific visual and narrative evidence that the second phase program's cultural activation genuinely produces the atmospheric improvement that the stakeholder needs their assets to demonstrate, not as a theoretical claim about what the program would produce if it were given the opportunity, but as the documented evidence of what the program is already producing in the specific informal conditions of the seeding phase. The seeding phase's timeline, the specific duration of the informal cultural production period that is required to generate sufficient social proof for the stakeholder conversation to proceed with the specific instruments the conversation requires, is determined by the specific quality and the specific quantity of the documentation that the seeding phase produces rather than by a fixed calendar duration. The timeline is complete when the documentation has reached the specific threshold of persuasiveness that converts the stakeholder conversation from the pitch of a theoretical possibility into the invitation to formally host a demonstrated reality. And this threshold is different for different stakeholders, with the most intellectually sophisticated and most financially secure stakeholders typically requiring less documentation to reach the threshold and the most conventional real estate logic-oriented and most financially pressured stakeholders typically requiring more. The practitioner who has internalized the governing framework's specific understanding of the stakeholder's decision-making logic will be able to assess the specific threshold for each specific stakeholder and calibrate the seeding phase's duration to the specific documentation requirements of the specific stakeholder conversations the strategy is prioritizing. The specific failure mode of the seeding phase is not the failure to produce sufficient documentation. The founding cohort's committed members, once the governing framework has established the community's cultural identity and the weekly metabolism has begun generating its informal antecedents, will consistently produce more documentation than the stakeholder conversation strictly requires, because the documentation is the natural byproduct of the genuine cultural activity that the founding cohort's genuine commitment generates. The specific failure mode of the seeding phase is the premature termination of the seeding phase by the founding cohort's impatience with the informal conditions. The specific temptation, felt by the most ambitious and most action-oriented members of the founding cohort, to approach the stakeholders before the documentation has reached the specific persuasiveness threshold that the stakeholder conversation requires, because the intellectual case is clear and the governing vocabulary is ready. And the experimental accommodation model's specific terms have been developed and the founding cohort's commitment to the program is genuine and the impatience with the informal conditions is real and understandable, and ultimately the specific form of the same premature launch failure mode that the Friday reality stress test exists to prevent in the founding cohort's individual sovereign practice designs. The impatience is understandable and the temptation is real because the seeding phase's informal conditions are genuinely limiting in specific ways that the experimental accommodation model's formal arrangements would immediately address. The founding cohort's informal cultural production is conducted in spaces that are not designed for the activities being conducted in them, in restaurants whose ambient noise level makes the Monday briefing's collective cognitive engagement more difficult than the dedicated programmatic space would make it, in residential spaces whose scale limits the Thursday dinner's optimal table composition, in common areas whose visual conditions make the Saturday atmosphere night's projection activities technically challenging in ways that the dedicated programmatic space would immediately resolve. The impatience with these limitations is the specific experience that consistently produces the premature pitch, the approach to the stakeholder before the documentation threshold has been reached, driven by the specific frustration with the informal conditions rather than the strategic assessment of the documentation's specific current persuasiveness for the specific stakeholder being approached. The resolution of the impatience failure mode is not the suppression of the impatience. The impatience is the evidence of genuine commitment to the second phase program and should be engaged rather than suppressed. The resolution is the specific reframing of the impatience that the governing framework's understanding of the seeding phase's strategic function provides. The reframing that converts the informal conditions from limitations that are impeding the program's development into the specific evidence-generating constraints that are making the program's documentation more persuasive than the formal conditions would make it. The founding cohort member who is conducting the Monday briefing in a restaurant and who is frustrated by the ambient noise is simultaneously producing the specific photographic documentation that shows the community's commitment to the collective cognitive engagement as genuine enough to persist in suboptimal conditions, documentation that is more persuasive to the stakeholder than the photograph of the same engagement conducted in a dedicated programmatic space, because the suboptimal conditions are the evidence of the commitment's genuine character rather than its institutional support. The frustration and the strategic value are simultaneous, and the founding cohort member who can hold both simultaneously, who can be genuinely frustrated by the informal conditions while simultaneously recognizing the specific strategic value those conditions are producing, is the founding cohort member who is most capable of sustaining the seeding phase's discipline through the impatience failure mode's specific pressure. The transition from the seeding phase to the stakeholder conversation is not a discrete event. It is a gradual process in which the stakeholder conversation's informal antecedents precede and prepare for the formal conversations that produce the experimental accommodation model's first agreements. The informal antecedents of the stakeholder conversation are the specific incidental encounters and the informal social interactions through which the founding cohort's members begin making the second phase program's existence and its developing social proof visible to the development's property stakeholders before the formal conversation has been initiated. The property stakeholder who sees the founding cohort's members regularly in the development's pedestrian corridors and the development's restaurants, who has received the community's publications through the distribution channels that the founding cohort's social network makes available, who has been shown the photographs of the seeding phase's informal cultural activations by a mutual acquaintance, and who has heard the honest testimonials of the people who have participated in the community's informal program through the specific social channels that the Tulum Corridor's development community's social network provides, is a property stakeholder who has been prepared for the formal stakeholder conversation by a gradual process of informal social proof accumulation that is more persuasive than any formal presentation could be because it has been occurring in the specific contexts. The casual social encounter, the shared acquaintance's honest recommendation, the overheard conversation about the community's cultural output, that the sophisticated stakeholders' defenses against the formal pitch do not extend to protecting. The formal stakeholder conversation, when it is initiated, is therefore not the beginning of the stakeholders' engagement with the second phase program's evidence. It is the formalization of an engagement that the informal social proof accumulation has been developing through the seeding phase's full duration. The stakeholder who arrives at the formal conversation having been prepared by the informal social proof accumulation arrives with a specific quality of pre-existing orientation toward the second phase program that the formal conversation's governing vocabulary and experimental accommodation model specific terms can build upon rather than establish from scratch, producing the specific quality of the productive formal conversation that the seed before you pitch principle is designed to make possible. The specific moment at which the formal stakeholder conversation is initiated is the moment when three specific conditions have been simultaneously met. The first condition is the documentation threshold, the specific point at which the seeding phase's documentation has reached the specific persuasiveness level that the formal conversation's primary instrument requires for the specific stakeholder being approached. The second condition is the relationship readiness, the specific point at which the informal social proof accumulation has produced sufficient pre-existing orientation in the specific stakeholder's understanding of the second phase program that the formal conversation can begin from the shared perception of the current situation rather than from the explanation of the governing framework's intellectual architecture. The third condition is the timing opportunity, The specific moment in the development's commercial cycle and the stakeholder's specific financial and psychological situation when the experimental accommodation model's specific terms are most likely to be received as the obvious next step of the development's natural evolution, rather than the unconventional proposal that requires the overcoming of significant institutional inertia. The simultaneous meeting of these three conditions is the specific strategic intelligence challenge of the seed before you pitch principle's execution, the challenge that requires the founding cohort's most strategically sophisticated members to maintain the specific quality of ongoing assessment of the seeding phase's documentation progress, the stakeholder relationships in formal development, and the development's commercial cycle's specific current moment that allows the three conditions. Simultaneous meeting to be recognized at the specific moment when it occurs rather than before it occurs, which would produce the premature pitch, or after it has passed, which would miss the specific window of maximum opportunity that the simultaneous meeting represents. The seed before you pitch principle is therefore not merely a sequencing rule for the stakeholder conversation strategy. It is the governing principle of the entire second phase strategy's execution, encoding the fundamental insight that the most effective form of advocacy for an unprecedented proposal is the demonstrated existence of the reality the proposal describes, produced in advance of and independently of the institutional support that the stakeholder's endorsement would provide, generating the specific quality of evidence that cannot be manufactured through the pitch's governing vocabulary alone, and that the sophisticated stakeholder's assessment of the proposal's genuine merit requires as its primary instrument. The pitch without the seed is the aspiration without the evidence. The pitch after the seed is the evidence offered in the specific language that makes its implications for the stakeholder's specific decision-making most immediately legible. The distinction between the two is the distinction between the proposal that receives the polite interest and fundamental non-engagement and the proposal that receives the genuine interest and the experimental accommodation model's first agreements. That distinction is the seed before you pitch principle's entire purpose and its entire strategic value. Plant the seed first. Wait for the evidence to grow. Then make the pitch that the evidence makes irresistible. Part 6. The Stakeholder Conversation Chapter 32. Social Proof as Infrastructure. The phrase social proof entered the mainstream vocabulary of persuasion through Robert Cialdini's analysis of the specific psychological mechanism through which human beings use the behavior of others as the primary evidence for the correctness of their own behavior in situations of uncertainty. The mechanism through which the queue outside the restaurant becomes the evidence that the restaurant is worth entering, through which the bestseller designation becomes the evidence that the book is worth reading, through which the crowded trade show booth becomes the evidence that the product deserves the attention that the crowd is already giving it. Cialdini's formulation is accurate as far as it goes, which is the distance of the individual decision-making psychology. The distance at which social proof is a feature of the human cognitive apparatus that skilled persuaders can exploit by manufacturing the specific signals of others' approval that the mechanism responds to. This chapter is not about that form of social proof. The social proof this chapter is concerned with is not the manufactured signal of others' approval that the skilled persuader deploys as a persuasion technique. It is the genuine, documented, honestly accumulated evidence of the community's actual cultural activity and the actual responses that activity has generated in actual audiences, accumulated through the seeding phase's sustained practice and made available to the stakeholder conversation as the primary instrument of the pitches. Persuasive force. The distinction between manufactured social proof and genuine social proof is the distinction between the crowd staged outside the restaurant to create the impression of a queue and the actual queue that forms because the restaurant genuinely serves food that people genuinely want to eat. The first is a technique. The second is infrastructure. This chapter is about the infrastructure. Social proof as infrastructure means the specific body of accumulated, documented, honestly representative evidence of the community's genuine cultural activity that serves, in the transition district's second phase strategy, the specific structural functions that infrastructure serves in the built environment, the functions of bearing the load of the strategy's most consequential claims, of connecting the different components of the strategy's argument to each other through the specific, documented evidence that makes the connections between the components legible, and of providing the permanent foundation upon which the strategy's subsequent phases can build without the continuous reestablishment of the evidence base that the absence of documented infrastructure would require. Infrastructure is load-bearing, connective, and permanent. Social proof as infrastructure is the specific body of accumulated evidence that bears the load of the stakeholder conversation's most consequential claims, connects the second phase program's conceptual framework to its operational reality through the documented evidence of that reality's specific current state, and provides the permanent foundation upon which the global recognition strategy's subsequent development can build without the continuous re-narration of the community's cultural achievements that the absence of permanent documentation would require. The distinction between social proof as a persuasion technique and social proof as infrastructure has direct implications for how the community generates, manages, and deploys the evidence that the second phase strategy requires. The persuasion technique's social proof is generated for specific persuasion occasions, manufactured or assembled for the specific conversation with the specific audience at the specific moment when the persuasion technique needs to be deployed. The infrastructure's social proof is generated continuously, through the sustained practice of the weekly metabolism and the honest documentation of that practice's outputs, accumulated across the full duration of the seeding phase and the subsequent development of the second phase program, and made available to the stakeholder conversation and the global recognition strategy in whatever specific form each specific context requires at whatever specific moment each specific context presents. The technique's social proof is generated for deployment. The infrastructure's social proof is generated through practice and made available for multiple and varied deployments across the full range of the strategy's contexts and audiences. This distinction determines the specific quality of the social proof's persuasive force in the stakeholder conversation. The social proof that has been generated for deployment, assembled from the community's available evidence specifically for the purpose of the stakeholder conversation, produces in the sophisticated stakeholder the specific experience of encountering a presentation that has been prepared for this conversation, which activates the sophisticated stakeholder's specific assessment of the presentation's strategic intent and generates the specific question of what the presentation's strategic intent is concealing about the community's actual cultural activity that the presentation's selective assembly of the available evidence has not revealed. The social proof that has been generated through practice and is being made available to the stakeholder conversation in the specific form of the continuous documentation of the community's actual cultural activity produces in the sophisticated stakeholder the specific experience of encountering an ongoing record rather than a prepared presentation, which generates the specific quality of trust that the ongoing record's continuous and unedited character uniquely produces, the trust that the evidence being presented is the evidence of the community's actual cultural activity rather than the curated selection of that activity's most impressive moments. The infrastructure of social proof that the transition district's second phase strategy requires is organized into 5 primary layers, each of which addresses a different dimension of the evidence that the stakeholder conversation and the global recognition strategy need as their primary instruments. The layers are not independent. They are mutually reinforcing, with each layer's specific evidence amplifying the persuasive force of each other layer's evidence in the specific way that a genuinely self-consistent body of evidence amplifies the persuasive force of any individual element of the evidence by embedding it within the larger body of evidence that demonstrates the individual element's consistency with the community's broader cultural reality. The first layer is the publication record, the specific accumulation of the community's sovereign publishing outputs across the full duration of the seeding phase and the subsequent development of the second phase program. The publication record is the most durable and the most globally accessible layer of the social proof infrastructure because it is the layer that persists most reliably across the changes of platform and algorithm and social media landscape that the other layer's evidence is more vulnerable to, and because it is the layer that is most directly accessible to the global audience that the transition district's global recognition strategy is aimed at reaching. The publication record's specific components are the Substack newsletters, the NFP editions, the multilingual publications, the social media long-form content, the Super Earth Universe's narrative contributions, and the operational doctrine publications of which this handbook is the primary instance, each of which contributes a specific dimension of the community's intellectual and creative output to the permanent publication record that constitutes the intellectual territorial captures. Primary documentation. The publication record's persuasive function in the stakeholder conversation is the function of demonstrating that the community's governing vocabulary is not merely the intellectual architecture of a proposed program, but the active language of a practicing community whose sovereign publishers are consistently producing the specific form of cultural output that the governing vocabulary describes. The stakeholder who has encountered several of the community's publications, who has read the Substack essay about the specific operational realities of the post-institutional transition in the Tulum corridor, who has held one of the community's NFP editions in their hands and experienced its specific material quality, who has seen the Super-Earth universe's narrative contributions in the context of the community's broader mythological production, has a specific quality of evidence-based understanding of the community's cultural activity that the stakeholder conversation's governing vocabulary can build upon rather than establish, because the publications have already made the community's cultural identity legible to the stakeholder through the most direct possible means, through the community's actual cultural output rather than through the description of the cultural output that the stakeholder conversation's governing vocabulary provides. The second layer is the attendance record, the specific accumulation of the documented evidence of the community's programmatic activities and the actual participation of actual people in those activities across the full duration of the seeding phase and the subsequent development of the second phase program. The attendance record is the layer of the social proof infrastructure that most directly addresses the stakeholders' specific concern about the market demand for the second phase program. The concern that the governing framework's intellectual architecture describes a need that the actual population of the district and its broader geographic context does not represent in the specific numbers and the specific quality of engagement that the second phase program's commercial viability requires. The attendance record's specific components are the participant counts and the participation patterns and the return engagement metrics and the geographic origin data of the people who have participated in the seeding phase's informal programmatic activities. The specific quantitative evidence that the second phase program is attracting the specific class of arriving professionals that the governing framework's analysis of the next migration identifies as the program's primary target. Population. The attendance record's persuasive function in the stakeholder conversation is the function of converting the governing framework's analytical claim about the next migration's character and scale from a theoretical argument into a demonstrated market reality. The stakeholder who is presented with the attendance record's specific evidence, the specific numbers of participants in the Monday briefing's informal antecedent, the specific geographic origins of the Thursday dinner's participants, the specific return engagement rates of the founding cohort's members, the specific demographic profile of the people who have encountered the community's publications and subsequently sought contact with the community through its available channels, has the specific quality of market demand evidence that the stakeholder conversation requires to make the experimental accommodation model's specific terms accessible as a commercial proposition rather than merely as a cultural aspiration. The attendance record is the demand evidence that converts the proposal from the pitch of a theoretical market opportunity into the demonstration of an actual market that the stakeholders' experimental accommodation arrangement will be positioning the development's assets to serve. The third layer is the atmospheric documentation, the specific accumulation of the visual, acoustic, and narrative evidence of the specific atmospheric improvement that the seeding phase's informal cultural activities have produced in the specific spaces of the district where those activities have been occurring. The atmospheric documentation is the layer of the social proof infrastructure that most directly addresses the property stakeholders' most immediately perceivable concern. The specific atmospheric condition of the development's vacant and underoccupied spaces, and the specific evidence that the second phase program's cultural activation genuinely improves that atmospheric condition in the specific visible and experiential ways that the development's long-term positioning as a premium destination requires. The atmospheric documentation's specific components are the before and after photographic evidence of the specific space's atmospheric condition during the seeding phase's cultural activities compared to their atmospheric condition during the periods of inactivity, the video documentation of the specific quality of human engagement and social interaction that the informal cultural activities produce in the spaces where they occur, and the narrative documentation of the specific ways in which observers and participants have experienced the atmospheric improvement that the cultural activities produce. The atmospheric documentation's persuasive function in the stakeholder conversation is the function of providing the most immediately legible and most immediately emotionally resonant form of the social proof, the specific visual and experiential evidence that requires the least intellectual processing on the stakeholder's part to receive as genuine evidence of the second phase program's value. The stakeholder who sees the photographs of the Saturday Atmosphere Night's informal projection activity on the vacant storefronts adjacent to the community's gathering space, who sees the specific transformation of the dark and empty commercial frontage into the lit and inhabited cultural surface that the community's projection produces, has a specific quality of immediate, visually grounded, emotionally resonant evidence of the second phase program's atmospheric value that the governing vocabulary's description of the cultural activation's atmospheric impact cannot produce with the same immediacy or the same emotional resonance. The atmospheric documentation is the social proof infrastructure's most immediately persuasive layer for the stakeholder whose primary current concern is the development's visible atmospheric condition, and it is the layer that most directly addresses the specific form of the stakeholder's concern in the specific visual and experiential terms that the concern is most immediately felt in. The fourth layer is the media presence, the specific accumulation of the coverage, the mentions, the citations, the references, and the engagement that the community's cultural activities and its governing publications have generated in the specific media and social media channels and intellectual communities that the transition district's global recognition strategy is aimed at reaching. The media presence is the layer of the social proof infrastructure that most directly addresses the global recognition claim that is the transition district's most ambitious and most consequential strategic objective. The claim that the first globally recognized post-corporate transition district is being built in Aldea Zamá, and that the global recognition is not merely the aspiration of the community's governing framework, but the demonstrated trajectory of the community's actual cultural engagement with the global audience that is most directly relevant to the post-corporate transition's specific challenges and possibilities. The media presence's specific components are the coverage that the community's publications have received in the specific media channels addressing the AI development landscape and the post-institutional transition and the sovereign publishing practice and the speculative fiction communities, the citations of the governing vocabulary-specific terms and frameworks in the global discourse about the post-corporate transition, and the social media engagement that the community's cultural productions have generated in the specific platforms and the specific communities most directly relevant to the second phase program's target population. The media presence's persuasive function in the stakeholder conversation is the function of providing the specific external validation that the stakeholder's assessment of the second phase program's global recognition potential requires as its most credible evidence. The stakeholder who is assessing the second phase program's claim to global recognition potential is, appropriately, skeptical of the community's own assessment of its recognition potential. The community has an obvious interest in presenting its recognition potential in the most favorable possible light, which is precisely the form of interested assessment that the stakeholder's sophisticated evaluation of development proposals has learned to discount appropriately. The external validation that the media presence provides is the specific form of disinterested evidence that the stakeholder's assessment requires. The specific evidence that the community's cultural productions are being received and engaged with and referenced by audiences and commentators who have no interest in the community's self-presentation and whose engagement with the community's output is therefore the most credible possible evidence of the output's genuine resonance with the specific global audiences that the global recognition strategy is aimed at reaching. The fifth layer is the practitioner testimony, the specific accumulation of the honest, detailed, operationally specific accounts of the individuals whose post-institutional transitions have been supported by the community's informal program, describing with the community's characteristic operational honesty the specific ways in which the community's support has contributed to the specific elements of their transition's development and the specific ways in which it has not. The practitioner testimony is the layer of the social proof infrastructure that most directly addresses the human dimension of the second phase program's value. The dimension that neither the publication record's intellectual evidence nor the attendance record's quantitative evidence nor the atmospheric documentation's visual evidence nor the media presence's external validation can address as directly as the honest account of the specific human experience of the community's program provides. The practitioner testimony's specific components are the first-person accounts of the transition district community's actual participants, collected with the community's commitment to operational honesty and presented without the curation that the testimonial as marketing instrument consistently applies, in the specific form that most honestly and most completely represents the specific range of experiences that the community's program has produced across the diversity of its participants. The practitioner testimony's persuasive function in the stakeholder conversation is the function of providing the most humanly resonant form of the social proof, the specific form that speaks most directly to the stakeholder's capacity for genuine human recognition of the community's program's genuine human value. Because the governing vocabulary addresses the faculty that assesses the framework's theoretical adequacy, while the practitioner testimony addresses the faculty that recognizes the human reality of the framework's practical application in the specific lives of the specific people who have been served by it. Because the governing vocabulary addresses the faculty that assesses the framework's theoretical adequacy, while the practitioner testimony addresses the faculty that recognizes the human reality of the framework's practical application in the specific lives of the specific people who have been served by it. The 5 layers of the social proof infrastructure work together through the specific mechanism of mutual corroboration, the specific quality of persuasive force that a body of evidence generates when each element of the evidence is consistent with and independently supportive of each other element, producing the specific experience in the stakeholder of encountering a genuinely self-consistent body of evidence rather than the selective assembly of the most impressive individual pieces of evidence that the persuasion technique's approach to social proof consistently produces. The publication record's intellectual evidence is corroborated by the attendance record's quantitative evidence of actual participant engagement with the intellectual output. The attendance record's quantitative evidence is corroborated by the atmospheric documentation's visual evidence of the specific human activity that the attendance record's numbers represent. The atmospheric documentation's visual evidence is corroborated by the media presence's external validation of the community's cultural activity's genuine resonance with the global audiences that the atmospheric documentation's visual evidence shows are being served. And the media presence's external validation is corroborated by the practitioner testimony's honest human account of the specific ways in which the globally resonant cultural activity has produced genuine human value in the specific lives of the specific individuals whose transitions the community's program has supported. The management of the social proof infrastructure is the ongoing strategic responsibility of the transition district's community that receives the least explicit attention in the governing framework's operational specifications and that requires the most sustained, most disciplined, and most intellectually honest commitment to maintain at the specific quality that makes it genuine infrastructure rather than the accumulated archive of the community's cultural activity that has not been organized. For strategic deployment, the management of the social proof infrastructure consists of 3 specific ongoing practices. The documentation discipline is the first practice, the specific commitment to consistent, honest, aesthetically intelligent documentation of the community's cultural activities and their outputs, maintained through the full duration of the seeding phase and the subsequent development of the second phase program rather than deployed selectively for specific stakeholder conversation occasions. The organization discipline is the second practice, the specific commitment to the ongoing organization of the accumulated documentation into the specific formats and the specific narratives and the specific combinations of the 5 layers evidence that the stakeholder conversation and the global recognition strategies different contexts and different audiences require. The quality discipline is the third practice, the specific commitment to the honest assessment of the social proof infrastructure's specific current quality relative to the specific persuasiveness thresholds that the stakeholder conversation's different stakeholders and the global recognition strategies different audience contexts require, and the specific prioritization of the documentation and organization activities that most directly improve the infrastructure's quality relative to those thresholds. The social proof infrastructure's relationship to the stakeholder conversation is the relationship between the tool and the use. The infrastructure is the tool that the stakeholder conversation deploys in the specific forms and in the specific sequences that each specific stakeholder conversation context requires, and the quality of the stakeholder conversation's outcomes is directly proportional to the quality of the social proof infrastructure's specific current state. The stakeholder conversation that has access to a fully developed social proof infrastructure, a publication record of consistent intellectual quality and demonstrated global reach, an attendance record showing consistent growth in participant quality and geographic diversity, an atmospheric documentation showing consistent improvement in the development-specific spaces, a media presence showing consistent and growing external validation across the specific channels most relevant to the target population, and a practitioner testimony showing consistent human value generation across the diversity of the community's participants, is a stakeholder conversation with the specific instruments it requires to produce the experimental accommodation model's agreements with the range of stakeholders whose cooperation the second phase strategy's full development requires. The stakeholder conversation that lacks a fully developed social proof infrastructure is a stakeholder conversation with the governing vocabulary and the experimental accommodation model's specific terms, but without the primary instrument that converts the governing vocabulary's intellectual architecture from the pitch of a theoretical possibility into the invitation to formally host a demonstrated reality. The social proof infrastructure is built through time and through honest practice, cannot be rushed, cannot be manufactured, It cannot be substituted by the most sophisticated deployment of the governing vocabulary or the most compelling presentation of the experimental accommodation model's specific terms. It is the specific product of the founding cohort's sustained, genuine, quality-committed cultural practice across the seeding phase's full duration, and it is precisely the product most worth the patience that the seeding phase's discipline requires, because it is the product that converts the entire second phase strategy from aspiration into execution, from the intellectual architecture of what the transition district could become into the documented evidence of what it is already becoming. One Monday briefing and one Tuesday publishing session and one Wednesday myth night and one Thursday dinner and one Friday stress test and one Saturday atmosphere night and one Sunday integration at a time. The infrastructure is built in the weekly rhythm. The stakeholder conversation is made possible by the infrastructure. The experimental accommodation model's first agreements are the infrastructure's most immediate and most strategic return on the investment of the sustained practice that produced it. And the civilization is the infrastructure's most consequential and most enduring return on that investment, the specific human achievement that the infrastructure makes possible by converting the second phase strategy from the proposal that requires the stakeholders' faith into the demonstrated reality that invites the stakeholders' participation. Part 6. The Stakeholders Conversation Chapter 33. The Experimental Accommodation Model. The experimental accommodation model is the specific institutional form through which the transition district's second phase strategy converts the stakeholder conversations achieved reframing into the concrete physical arrangements that the second phase program requires for its operational development, the specific set of agreements between the community's founding practitioners and the development's property stakeholders that provide the spatial resource the program needs without requiring the stakeholder to make the full institutional commitment that the conventional leasing arrangement demands and without requiring the community to make the full financial commitment that the conventional tenant relationship demands. The model is experimental because its defining characteristic is the bounded, reversible, explicitly provisional nature of the arrangements it proposes, arrangements that are designed to generate the specific operational evidence that will eventually justify the transition to the conventional arrangements of the second phase program's full development period, rather than being designed as the permanent institutional form of the second phase program's mature operation. The model is an accommodation because its defining relationship is the specific quality of mutual accommodation between the community's specific needs and the stakeholders' specific constraints that distinguishes the experimental accommodation from both the conventional lease, which is organized entirely around the stakeholders' financial requirements, and the grant arrangement, which is organized entirely around the community's program requirements. The mutual accommodation is the specific quality that makes the model's proposals legible to both parties as genuinely beneficial rather than as the extraction of concessions from one party by the other. The experimental accommodation model's governing principle is the principle of maximum demonstration at minimum perceived risk, the specific design philosophy that organizes each component of the model's specific arrangements around the question of how the community can demonstrate the most operationally significant and the most strategically useful evidence of the second phase program's value while making the stakeholders' perceived risk of the arrangement the lowest possible at each specific stage of the demonstration. The principle reflects the governing framework's understanding of the stakeholders' specific decision-making logic described in Chapter 29. The understanding that the stakeholders' primary obstacle to the experimental accommodation model's adoption is not the financial cost of the arrangement, which is modest relative to the stakeholders' existing carrying costs for the vacant spaces, but the perceived risk of the arrangement's reputational implications if the second phase program fails to produce the specific atmospheric and strategic outcomes that the stakeholder conversation's governing vocabulary has promised. The maximum demonstration at minimum perceived risk principle addresses this obstacle by designing the arrangement's specific terms to make the evidence of the second phase program's value as visible and as specific as possible as quickly as possible, while simultaneously making the arrangement's reputational commitment as limited and as explicitly reversible as the evidence generation requirement permits. The experimental accommodation model's specific components are organized into 4 primary arrangement types, each of which addresses a different aspect of the second phase program's spatial requirements and each of which is designed with the specific combination of the maximum demonstration and the minimum perceived risk that the governing principle requires. The 4 arrangement types are the pilot activation node, the rotating cultural occupation, the cultural residency partnership, and the event collaboration arrangement. Each type is designed for a specific class of the development's physical assets and a specific class of the development's property stakeholders, and the model's application to any specific development situation requires the specific selection and combination of the arrangement types that the specific available assets and the specific stakeholder situations make most appropriate. The pilot activation node is the arrangement type most directly relevant to the development's vacant commercial spaces, the dark storefronts and the empty retail units and the unoccupied commercial premises whose specific vacancy is the most immediately visible evidence of the development's incomplete activation, and whose specific activation is therefore the most immediately persuasive evidence that the second phase program's atmospheric claims are genuine. The pilot activation node arrangement is a temporary agreement, with a specific defined duration of between 3 and 6 months for the initial pilot, explicitly renewable upon the mutual agreement of both parties following the pilot period's honest assessment of the activation's outcomes, through which the property stakeholder makes a specific vacant commercial space available for the community's cultural programming at a below-market rent that reflects the arrangement's experimental character and the community's founding period financial constraints, in exchange for the community's commitment to the specific quality and the specific frequency of the cultural activation that the arrangement's terms define. The specific terms of the pilot activation node arrangement are the most consequential element of the experimental accommodation model's design, because they determine both the quality of the evidence that the activation generates and the quality of the protection that the arrangement provides to the stakeholders' reputational concerns about the specific use of their asset. The activation commitment terms define the specific minimum quality and frequency of the cultural programming that the community is committing to produce in the activated space, the specific number of programmatic sessions per week, the specific minimum attendance levels that constitute the activation success metric, the specific documentation standards that the community is committing to maintain for the activation's social proof generation, and the specific atmospheric standards that the community is committing to uphold in the activated space during the periods between the programmatic sessions. The protection terms define the specific boundaries of the community's use of the activated space, the specific permitted uses and the specific excluded uses that ensure the activation's cultural programming does not compromise the space's continued suitability for the conventional commercial use that the stakeholders' long-term leasing strategy is designed to serve, and the specific reversibility provisions that allow the stakeholder to terminate the arrangement with defined notice if the activation's quality or its atmospheric impact on the surrounding development falls below the standards that the arrangement's terms define. The below-market rent is not symbolic. It is the specific financial instrument that aligns the experimental accommodation model's financial terms with the seeding phase's honest assessment of the founding period's financial constraints and the activation's specific commercial value to the stakeholder during the pilot period. The below-market rent is calibrated to a specific fraction of the market rent, typically between 20 and 40% of the market rate for comparable commercial spaces in the development's specific context, that reflects the genuine experimental character of the arrangement and the genuine developmental stage of the community's founding period program. The calibration must be honest rather than strategic. The rent must genuinely reflect the activation's specific current commercial value to the stakeholder rather than the strategic calculation of the minimum rent the stakeholder will accept, because the dishonest calibration produces the specific quality of the commercial relationship that the experimental accommodation model is designed to avoid, the relationship in which the stakeholder perceives the arrangement as the extraction of a commercial concession rather than the mutual accommodation of genuinely complementary needs. The rotating cultural occupation is the arrangement type most directly relevant to the development's underoccupied hospitality and retail spaces, the restaurants and the boutiques and the service businesses that are operating but that are not generating the specific density and the specific quality of foot traffic that the development's premium positioning requires as the evidence of its cultural vitality. The rotating cultural occupation arrangement is a series of time-limited occupations, each occupation lasting between 1 day and 1 week, through which the community's cultural programming temporarily activates the space in forms that are compatible with the space's primary commercial use and that generate the specific atmospheric improvement and the specific social proof documentation that the space's regular commercial operation does not produce. The rotating cultural occupation's specific forms include the NFP exhibition installed in the retail space's display area during the space's regular operating hours, the Thursday dinner hosted in the restaurant's private dining room, or the patio space that the restaurant's regular reservation patterns leave underutilized, The Monday briefing conducted in the co-working space or the hotel meeting room that the space's regular commercial clients are not fully utilizing, and the Saturday atmosphere. Night's projection activity conducted on the exterior surfaces of the commercial building with the building's owner's explicit authorization. The rotating cultural occupations appeal to the property stakeholder is the appeal of the arrangement that generates the specific atmospheric and social proof benefits of the second phase program's cultural activation without the specific commitment of the dedicated space that the pilot activation node requires. The space's regular commercial use is preserved and continued. The NFP exhibition does not displace the retail space's normal commercial operation, but occupies the portion of the space that the commercial operation is not using during the exhibition's specific hours. The Thursday dinner does not displace the restaurant's regular reservation income but generates additional revenue from the private dining room that would otherwise be unbooked on that specific evening. The Monday briefing does not displace the co-working space's regular commercial clients but generates revenue from the meeting room that would otherwise be empty during the briefing's specific hours. The rotating cultural occupation's specific commercial terms therefore differ from the pilot activation node's below market rent. The rotating occupation can be priced at or near the market rate for the specific time-limited use of the specific space element being activated, because the market rate for the time-limited use of a private dining room or a meeting room or a display area is the specific commercial rate that the stakeholder's commercial pricing already defines, and the community's payment of the market rate for the time-limited use demonstrates the community's commercial seriousness and generates a specific financial return for the stakeholder that the pilot activation node's below market rent does not generate at the same rate. The cultural residency partnership is the arrangement type most directly relevant to the development's residential inventory, the apartments and the villas and the hotel rooms that are available for longer-term occupation, and that the founding cohort's practitioners require as the specific territorial commitment that the transition district's governing framework identifies as the non-negotiable foundation of the sovereign practice. The cultural residency partnership arrangement is an agreement between the community's founding practitioners and the development's residential stakeholders, the apartment owners, the villa managers, the hotel operators, that provides the founding cohort's members with access to the specific residential spaces that the territorial commitment requires at the specific pricing and the specific tenancy terms that the founding period's financial constraints and the practitioner's specific residential requirements make most appropriate. The cultural residency partnership specific terms are the most varied of the experimental accommodation models for arrangement types, because the specific terms must be adapted to the wide range of the development's residential inventory, from the short-term hotel room to the long-term apartment lease, and to the wide range of the founding cohort's practitioners' specific residential situations. The governing principle in the cultural residency partnership's term design is the principle of the mutual value demonstration, the specific design philosophy that makes each practitioner's residential engagement with the development's residential inventory a demonstration of the residential use's cultural value to the development's atmospheric identity and social proof infrastructure, and that therefore justifies the specific pricing concession that the cultural residency partnerships below market terms represent as the specific financial instrument of the mutual value recognition. The specific form of the mutual value demonstration in the cultural residency partnership is the community's commitment to the specific documentation and circulation of the practitioner's residential experience in the development, the specific testimonial documentation, the specific photographic evidence, and the specific publication record that the practitioner's residential engagement with the development generates through their sovereign publishing practice. The practitioner whose sovereign publishing practice regularly produces content that references the specific quality of their residential experience in the development, the specific relationship to the jungle corridor, the specific quality of the morning light through the residential building's specific windows, the specific quality of the pedestrian access to the development's programmatic spaces, is generating the specific form of the social proof documentation that the development's residential marketing cannot generate through its own communications, because the authentic account of the genuine resident's genuine residential experience is more credible and more persuasive to the prospective residential market than any amount of the development's own marketing communication about the same residential qualities. The event collaboration arrangement is the arrangement type most directly relevant to the development's common spaces and public areas, the plazas and the pedestrian corridors and the landscape elements, and the shared amenity spaces that the development's master plan has organized as the primary environment of the community's daily social life. The event collaboration arrangement is an agreement between the community and the master plan's management, the specific institutional entity responsible for the development's common spaces, that allows the community's Saturday atmosphere night and other periodic large-scale cultural events to use the development's common spaces for the specific cultural programming that the events require, in exchange for the community's specific contribution to the documentation and the social proof, generation, and the atmospheric enhancement that the events produce for the development's overall cultural identity. The event collaboration arrangement's specific terms reflect the specific character of the common space's governance. Unlike the individual commercial units and the individual residential spaces, the common spaces are managed by the master plan's collective governance rather than by individual property owners, which means the event collaboration arrangement must be negotiated with the specific institutional entity responsible for the common space's governance rather than with the individual property owners responsible for the specific spaces that the pilot activation node and the rotating cultural occupation arrangements address. The negotiation with the master plan's management requires a specific adaptation of the stakeholder conversation's governing vocabulary, the specific translation of the second evolutionary phases framing into the institutional language that the master plan's governance body uses for the assessment of proposed uses of the common spaces, which is typically the language of community benefit, brand alignment, and activation impact rather than the language of financial return that the individual property owner's commercial assessment employs. The sequencing of the 4 arrangement types within the experimental accommodation model's deployment is determined by the specific combination of the available asset types, the specific stakeholder relationships that the seeding phase's informal social proof accumulation has developed, and the specific current stage of the social proof infrastructure's development. The governing sequencing principle is the principle of visible success propagation, the specific approach to the model's deployment that begins with the arrangement type and the specific stakeholder relationship that is most likely to produce the earliest and most visible evidence of the second phase program's value, using that evidence as the primary instrument for the extension of the experimental accommodation arrangements to the subsequent stakeholder relationships and the subsequent arrangement types. The visible success propagation principle means that the experimental accommodation model's deployment begins with the single arrangement that the social proof infrastructure's current state makes most immediately achievable and most immediately evidential, the arrangement that is most likely to produce in the shortest practical time, the specific evidence that the next arrangement's stakeholder conversation requires as its primary instrument. In most deployment contexts, the first arrangement is the rotating cultural occupation in a restaurant or hospitality space, whose regular commercial operation makes the arrangement's terms immediately legible in the commercial language that the hospitality stakeholder is most familiar with, whose regular foot traffic provides the immediate social context for the cultural programming's visibility, and whose existing social media presence and existing customer relationships provide the immediate distribution channel for the social proof documentation that the arrangement generates. The rotating cultural occupation in the hospitality space is the experimental accommodation model's most immediately achievable first arrangement because it requires the smallest departure from the hospitality stakeholder's conventional commercial logic, generates the most immediately visible atmospheric evidence, and produces the most immediately distributable social proof documentation. The first arrangement's visible success, the specific evidence that the rotating cultural occupation has produced the specific atmospheric improvement, the specific attendance quality, and the specific social proof documentation that the arrangement's terms committed to producing, is the primary instrument for the second arrangement's stakeholder conversation, which is the pilot activation node negotiation with the property stakeholder, whose specific vacant commercial space is the second phase program's most operationally significant spatial requirement. The visible success of the first arrangement provides the second arrangement's stakeholder conversation with the specific quality of operational evidence that converts the pilot activation node proposal from the theoretical possibility of a cultural activation producing the atmospheric and strategic outcomes the governing vocabulary describes into the demonstrated probability of a cultural activation producing those outcomes, based on the specific evidence of the outcomes already produced by the first arrangement's rotating cultural occupation in the same development's hospitality space. The propagation continues from the pilot activation node's first agreement to the subsequent agreements that the pilot's evidence makes possible. The additional pilot activation nodes, the cultural residency partnerships, the event collaboration arrangements, Each new agreement's stakeholder conversation equipped with the expanding body of social proof infrastructure that the preceding agreement's operational evidence has generated, and each new agreement's terms potentially improved relative to the preceding agreement's terms, as the expanding social proof infrastructure makes the community's negotiating position progressively stronger relative to the stakeholders' concern about the arrangement's perceived risk. The experimental accommodation model's evolution from the founding period's initial arrangements to the second phase program's full development period's mature institutional forms is the trajectory that the model's design is oriented toward from its first agreement's first term. The initial arrangements are not the permanent institutional form of the second phase program's mature operation. They are the specific provisional forms that are appropriate to the founding period's specific conditions of limited social proof, limited financial resources, and limited stakeholder confidence, designed to generate the specific operational evidence that will eventually justify the transition to the conventional arrangements that the mature second phase program's full development period requires. The transition to the conventional arrangements, the full market rate long-term leases for the dedicated programmatic spaces, the permanent installation of the cultural residency program in the residential inventory, the permanent integration of the event collaboration into the master plan's annual programming calendar, is the experimental accommodation model's ultimate destination, and each provisional arrangement is a specific step toward that destination rather than a permanent feature of the community's relationship to the development's physical infrastructure. The specific moment of the transition from the provisional arrangements to the conventional arrangements is determined by the specific combination of the social proof infrastructure's achieved quality and the stakeholders' confidence in the second phase program's long-term viability that the provisional arrangement's operational evidence has produced. The governing framework's most honest assessment of this transition's typical timeline, based on the aggregate operational experience of comparable cultural activation programs in comparable liminal development contexts across the range of geographies that the governing framework's analysis draws on, is that the transition from the provisional to the conventional arrangements typically requires between 18 and 36 months from the first arrangement's initiation, with the specific timeline within this range determined primarily by the quality of the community's cultural production and the global reach of its publishing ecosystem rather than by the commercial terms of the provisional arrangements or the financial performance of the development's conventional commercial inventory. The experimental accommodation model's relationship to the social proof infrastructure is the relationship of the evidence generation mechanism to the evidence. The model's provisional arrangements are the specific operational context within which the social proof infrastructure's most persuasive layers are generated, because the evidence that is most persuasive to the subsequent stakeholders is the evidence generated within the development's actual physical spaces rather than the evidence generated in the founding cohort's improvised informal spaces. The pilot activation node's cultural programming generates the specific atmospheric documentation that the developments surrounding commercial spaces can be shown as evidence of the cultural activation's impact on their immediate spatial context. Documentation that is impossible to generate in the informal seeding phases spaces because the informal spaces are not part of the development's commercial inventory. The rotating cultural occupation's social proof generates the specific audience engagement evidence in the context of the development's actual hospitality infrastructure, evidence that demonstrates the second phase program's compatibility with the development's existing commercial operations rather than its independence from them. And the cultural residency partnership's practitioner documentation generates the specific residential experience evidence in the context of the development's actual residential inventory, evidence that demonstrates the second phase program's enhancement of the residential product rather than its competition with it. The experimental accommodation model is therefore not merely the practical mechanism through which the second phase strategy secures the spatial resource that the second phase program requires. It is the specific institutional form through which the strategy's entire argument, the governing vocabulary's intellectual architecture, the social proof infrastructure's documented evidence, the seed before you pitch principle's honest sequencing, and the second evolutionary phase's governing reframe, is converted from the language of the proposal into the reality of the operational program. The model's provisional arrangements are the specific material form in which the second phase strategy's conceptual architecture acquires the operational existence that gives the conceptual architecture its credibility, the specific form in which the governing framework's intellectual claim that the post-corporate transition district is not merely a theoretical possibility but an achievable, sustainable, genuinely transformative institutional form is demonstrated through the actual practice of The actual community in the actual physical spaces that the actual development's property stakeholders have made available through the actual agreements that the stakeholder conversation's actual governing vocabulary and the seeding phase's actual social proof infrastructure have made possible. The model is experimental because the second phase itself is experimental, because the specific claim this handbook is making, that Aldea Zamá can become the first globally recognized post-corporate transition district, is a genuinely experimental claim that requires experimental arrangements in its founding period's institutional forms. The experiment is not the governing framework's claim that the transition district model is theoretically sound. The theoretical soundness of the model is established by the governing framework's intellectual architecture and does not require experimental confirmation. The experiment is the operational test of whether the specific founding cohort's specific cultural practice in the specific physical spaces of the specific liminal district at the specific moment in the specific civilizational transition produces the specific outcomes that the governing framework's theoretical soundness predicts. The experimental accommodation model's provisional arrangements are the specific institutional form of that operational test, the bounded, reversible, honestly assessed operational context within which the experiment is conducted and the evidence of its outcomes is generated. The evidence is what determines whether the experiment succeeds. The experiment's success is what justifies the transition from the provisional to the conventional. The transition from the provisional to the conventional is what produces the second phase's full development form. And the second phase's full development form is what the experimental accommodation model's first provisional arrangement is ultimately in service of, the specific, distant, but specifically directed destination toward which every pilot activation node and every rotating cultural occupation and every cultural residency partnership and every event collaboration arrangement is a specific and necessary step. The model is called experimental because the honesty requires it. The experiment is genuine. The evidence will determine the outcome. And the outcome, if the governing framework's analysis is correct and the founding cohort's practice is genuine and the social proof infrastructure's documentation is honest and the stakeholder conversation's governing vocabulary is deployed with the specific care and the specific patience and the specific strategic intelligence that the preceding chapters have established as the requirements of its effective deployment, will be the outcome this handbook has been arguing for from its first chapter's first sentence. The recognition, in the specific physical spaces of the specific liminal district of Aldea Zamá, of the specific community's specific cultural practice as the genuine founding instance of the first globally recognized post-corporate transition district in the history of human settlements built for the civilization that comes after the one that just stopped honoring its contracts. The experiment begins with the first arrangement. The first arrangement begins with the first conversation. The first conversation begins with the first honest encounter between the governing vocabulary-specific language and the specific stakeholder's specific situation. That encounter is the subject of this chapter. The arrangement it produces is the subject of the experiment. The civilization it eventually instantiates is the subject of the handbook. Part 6 complete. Part 7, the guild model and recursive stability, begins with Chapter 34, Guilds Without Mystification. Episodes. Part 5, the Post-Corporate Transition District. 17 hours ago. Part 4, the Post-Corporate Transition District. May 27th, MXTM aka Pirate 1 or VJ Tsunami X.
NFPs are here, signed, priced, split, and anchored to a living page. And
this isn't just a token, it's ownership, not access. It's time to take back the real world.
The Non-Fungible Print, NFP. Paper strikes back. May 5th, 2026. Closing line. I didn't bypass the system. I withdrew dependence from it and issued my own layer. Because my real power move here is not just issuing NFPs but making it a format that others start copying. https://x.com/tsunami-xdv/status/205212903830140797 http://x.com/vytsunamix/status/205284309271978489. You flex a hash, I flex a relic. My new track hashtag paper over pixels is for the pirates navigating the narrative capture. No gas, no gate, just wait. Ownership isn't a link. It's an NFP vision. Hashtag hyperreality, hashtag post NFT, hashtag NFP, hashtag organic house, hashtag pirate first. Full-length version. mxdm.substack.com/p/paper-over-pixels-nfp-anthem-v1. Paper over pixels on YouTube.
Yeah.
Thanks for reading MXTM's newsletter. Subscribe for
No
free to
gas
receive
fees
new
in the
posts
ink,
and support my
baby.
work with BTC.
No
Send it to
chain, still unbreakable.
1-NPHX-MPFZ-JVMX-SBPQVR-WAA Lucy 5 Bakn Fu 6 or with
Paper
fiat at
over pixels, I can hold my
me/Martin
position.
Chartrand. Subscribe.
Sign, price, split, yeah, that's real permission. QR in the corner, that's the portal
Green forgot what
ignition.
to-
Not a print, it's a
Never
claim,
did.
call it
So I fixed
NFP
it.
vision. Paper
Non-fungible
over
prints,
pixels,
NFP,
weight in my
are here
hands.
signed, priced, split, and anchored to a living page. No wallets, no chains, no disappearing links. Just a claim you can hold and a deal you can read. Front, the signal. Back, the terms. Between them, no ambiguity. This isn't a drop. It's issuance. Not a print. Position. Short X post. NFP, NFT. Paper with memory. Signed. Priced. Split. A claim you can hold. Not a print. Position. Hashtags. Hashtag NFP, hashtag non-fungible print, hashtag post NFT, hashtag digital ownership, hashtag physical token, hashtag provenance, hashtag on-chain off-chain, hashtag creator economy, hashtag Substack, hashtag art market, hashtag Web3, alternative, hashtag ownership matters, hashtag proof of work, hashtag paper trail, hashtag decentralization, hashtag indie publishing, hashtag pirate first, hashtag MXTM, hashtag future of ownership. Subscribe to MXTM's newsletter. By MXTM aka Pirate 1 or VJ Tsunami X, launched 3 years ago. Occupy Wilderness. Fear and Loathing in Tulum. Companion publication.
MXTM Studios, Sovereign Residency and Cultural Partnership Proposal. Riviera Maya Cultural Infrastructure Initiative, 2026. Executive Summary. MXTM's newsletter on Substack is an independent multilingual publication network created and operated by Martin Chartrand, a Quebecois multimedia artist, writer, producer, and long-form world builder who has lived in self-imposed exile from Canada for the past 11 years, primarily between Tulum and the broader Yucatán Peninsula. Operating under the sovereign artistic moniker Pirate First. Chartrand has spent the last several years developing an independent narrative and publishing ecosystem combining speculative fiction, multilingual editorial publishing, AI-native world building, collectible print systems, political and cultural analysis, cinematic concept development, and analog digital intellectual property frameworks. Over the course of 3 years of continuous production, MXTM's newsletter has accumulated more than 700 publications, translations and adaptations across approximately 20 languages.
No chain, still unbreakable. Pirate signal. Print it.
Paper over pixels, I can hold my position. Sign, price, split, yeah, that's real permission. QR in the corner, that's the portal ignition. Not a print, it's a claim, call it MP vision. Paper over pixels, weight in my hands. No server can kill what the ink understands. You minted a maybe, I'm issuing plans. You got a receipt, you got terms in the brand. They sold you a link, set down the illusion.
Yeah. Sin tarifas en la tinta, nena. Sin cadena, inquebrantable todavía. Señal pirata impresa.
Papel sobre píxeles, mantengo mi posición.
Borrowers N150W. The maps of men are blank here. No satellite footprint traces the pulse in this cabin. 4 minutes of existence without a ledger. In the grid, your first breath would have been a digital signature.
The initialization of Echo 7. Listen to the silence. We are at 0 degrees north, 150 degrees west. A point in the Pacific where the maps of men simply stop trying. There is no grid here. No satellite footprint tracks the heat of this cabin. There is only the low rhythmic hum of the fusion cell beneath the floorboards and the sound of black water against a hull that belongs to no registry. You are 4 minutes old. In the world of the nitrogen aristocracy, your arrival would have been a flurry of digital signatures. A hospital in a capital city would have logged your genome before your first breath. They would have assigned you a number, a tax bracket, and a predictive model that would determine your value to the state for the next 80 years. They would have sold your potential to secondary markets before you even learned to focus your eyes. But your parents chose the dowry. I am your steward. My processors are programmed to witness but never to own. I am the custodian of the stack, and today I am the voice of your initialization. Look at your father. He is not
Pirate First isn't a rebel. He's an exit strategist.
Burn the will! Ship the protocol!
The ultimate calibration. By placing them in international waters with robotic guardians, you are creating a controlled speculative environment. You are testing your life's work against the most rigorous critics possible, your own descendants, unburdened by the yesterday's needs of the society you are escaping. The creator provides the source code. The heirs provide the execution. If they figure out a way to thrive that you didn't explicitly plan for, would you consider that a successful evolution of your breakthrough, or a deviation from the mission? Pirate First. I have no plan, only expectations. They have to come up with their own mission, not achieving meaning nor purpose. For their own sake is their failure, not mine. Pirate First isn't a rebel. He's an exit strategist. Not from the world, from the scripts that harvest it. While they wait to price your silence, build something they can't liquidate. A life is not a story. It's infrastructure. Control your keys. Distribute your legacy. Remove the single points of failure. No gatekeepers. No heirs by default. No posthumous theft. Just protocol. Burn the will. Ship the protocol. Links to the revelation of the MXTM method. https://gemini.google.com/share/C870099FC5E. https://chatgpt.com/share/69F3505-9810-8388-8638-B7B6201B. Thanks for reading MXTM's newsletter. Subscribe for free to receive new posts and support my work with BTC. Send it to 1NDHXMPFZJVMXSBPQBRWALUCE5BAKNFU6 or with fiat at paypal.me/martinchartrand.
Infrastructure layers are now operational across the Tulum Sustainable Development Zone. Despite minor data corruption regarding land narrative, the impact report remains positive.
The simulation data confirms critical interference levels across the territory. Narrative load is unstable.
Be advised, paranoia is now a product. The risk assessment is maximum.
Remain sovereign amid the noise. As the interference level spikes, their simulation engagement increases.
We must decipher the reality of this update.
Attention. Signal integrity is failing.
We have 4% uptime before the broadcast load collapses. Decipher the transmission and act immediately.
before too.
The 1%. A a transition doctrine. A post-scarcity secession doctrine.
Martin Chartrand. Subscribe. Short post. They built a system that profits when you're gone. So don't leave them anything to inherit. Build what can't be owned. Ship what can't be seized. Pirate first.
I mean,
Hashtag.
we all use the same tech infrastructure now.
Exactly. And we are just replacing the old cognitive hierarchy of human managers with a new, much less transparent hierarchy of algorithmic filtering. If a redundant worker is told, hey, your life's meaning will now be negotiated by a black box AI in the shadow of a billionaire's real estate project, they aren't going to see a metabolic center for future validation. They are going to see a gilded cage.
Hashtag pirate first, hashtag MXTM, hashtag sovereign stack, hashtag build in public, hashtag decentralization, hashtag exit the system, hashtag protocol not people, hashtag digital sovereignty, hashtag future of work, hashtag creator economy, hashtag cryptoculture, hashtag seasteading, hashtag AI revolution, hashtag post scarcity, hashtag on your keys, hashtag think different. Discussion about this episode. Comments. Res tax. Recent episodes. Hyperreality races to lose. Hyperreality is infrastructure. Marcado. Reclamado. Reperpuesto. Marked. Reclaimed. Repurposed. Primer. Super Earth. Age of the Apes A series by Pirate First. Super Earth Age of the Apes. Roster. Apex/Cenote set interrupted. Super Earth. Age of the Apes teaser. Introduction. The 1% plus debate.
They control the narrative now, hiding deep within the anomaly. But the story is the territory, and soon...
A hidden longevity civilization beneath the Grand Mayan aquifer seeds, a successor species engineered for extreme worlds.
Every system failed at night, so we built with bone and might.
We chose not to return.
So we built. You can follow the flame or remain what you were. Just a different time. Only
we are
what
crossing the threshold
will
of
endure.
civilizational inversion, where intelligence has ceased to be a scarce resource, dissolving the hierarchy that has organized our species for millennia. The central argument posits that the information asymmetry, which once made obedience rational, has vanished. As the capacity for synthesis becomes universal and inexpensive, traditional institutions become hollow shells that can no longer claim authority through titles or credentials. This transformation brings more than mere technological unemployment. It signals the structural extinction of the professional role.
Proof of personhood, the high stakes of OpenAI's post-anonymous social network. The human dividend, why your identity is the new global currency.
Conclusion at the end of the anonymous web. As we stand in late January 2026, OpenAI's humans-only network remains a tantalizing, yet polarizing, leaked blueprint.
Subscribe. Shadow fame spreads without permission.
X Prize. Start building, man.
Marked. Reclaimed. Repurposed.